On this Saturday night, the big morale boost for Ukraine. Russia's only road to Crimea collapses.
This is all Putin can do now, is rattle his nuclear saber.
Plus the fears over Putin's next play. More protests in Iran and Canada as Western pressure increases. Deadly heat and record-setting droughts.
It is an absolutely dire situation.
The worries over water as dead fish pile up in BC. And from a small living room to a turkey warehouse.
She hollers, we run.
Meet Maria, the Thanksgiving angel.
Global National with Farah Nasser.
A huge explosion on the only bridge connecting mainland Russia with Russian-occupied Crimea, partially collapsing a key supply route for Moscow's military in its ongoing war on Ukraine. Russian officials say 3 people were killed on the Kerch Strait Bridge in what appears to be a truck bomb attack. Ukraine hasn't claimed direct responsibility. Now, this isn't just a logistical blow to the Kremlin. It's deeply symbolic, a humiliating defeat for Vladimir Putin himself, happening a day after his 70th birthday on one of his most prized infrastructure projects that he himself unveiled in 2018. Ukrainians didn't wait long to commemorate the apparent attack. Mere hours later, people were already posing and taking selfies in front of a billboard showing what appears to be a new stamp depicting the bridge's destruction. And Monobank, that's Ukraine's second largest bank, says it's already issuing this debit card design, showing the same thing. And a short time ago, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made an apparent reference to the bridge blast during his nightly video address, describing Crimea as cloudy but warm today. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. This moment in the war is being met with mixed emotion. A day of jubilation in Ukraine, but hanging over that, there and around the world, the feeling of fear over Russia's retaliation. And as Jennifer Johnson reports, it could lead to a major escalation, even in the coming days, to a conflict that's already heating up from both sides.
Ukrainian officials have repeatedly threatened to strike the much-hated bridge to cut off one of Russia's major supply arteries into their country. But Ukraine has not claimed responsibility for the bombing. Some Russian lawmakers are calling on President Vladimir Putin to retaliate as Ukrainian forces continue to reclaim territory once controlled by the Kremlin.
The way his military has performed in this war is not indicative of a major superpower.
Russia has now named a new military commander to lead its war effort, as some Russian forces are reportedly fleeing battle areas. Military experts say now is the time for world leaders to step up and further aid Ukraine.
In the next 1 to 3 months, the Americans and all of the NATO allies will continue to provide as much support to the Ukrainians as possible. The intention is to help them retake as much territory as they can.
Meanwhile, both sides are trading blame for shelling overnight near Ukraine's Russian-occupied nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe. The plant is now using emergency diesel generators to power cooling and safety functions for as long as 10 days to avoid a potential nuclear disaster. Plant engineers are racing to repair the plant's power line. But Putin's losses are mounting, leaving some military experts concerned he may resort to using short-range nuclear weapons to try and win this war.
This is all Putin can do now, is rattle his nuclear saber. And I think he has to know that if he uses a nuclear weapon, the consequences would be unbearable for him.
The top Republican of the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee is calling on world powers to try and reason with Putin.
I think every nation in the United Nations needs to warn Putin this will not be tolerated, including the nations that have stayed on the sidelines.
But Putin is showing no sign of backing down, and there is growing concern the bombing of the bridge, an embarrassing blow to him, may lead to further aggression against Ukraine. Jennifer Johnson, Global News, Washington.
More deadly protests erupted across Iran today against the regime's deeply entrenched religious dress codes and brutality against women. Outrage is growing on multiple fronts. The new coroner's report claiming Mahsa Amini died from organ failure, not blows to her body, and the deaths of 2 teenage girls, Serena Ismailzadeh and Nika Shakarami, reportedly killed by the country's security forces during the ongoing demonstrations that have entered a 4th week. At least 2 more protesters were reportedly killed by security forces today.
Regime change! Regime change! Regime change! With criminal...
And large crowds gathered in Vancouver and Toronto today, protesting for the rights of Iranian women. It comes after Prime Minister Justin Trudeau demanded an end to the Iranian government's crackdown on the mass protests, announcing new sanctions and a freeze of Canadian-held assets. Iran denies security forces are responsible for the deaths of Amini or the two teenagers, but the situation is painting a dark picture of the dangers for those standing up and speaking out. British Columbia at this time of year is normally cool and wet, deserving its reputation as the wet coast. But this year, things are pretty different. Just yesterday, 19 temperature records were shattered across the province. The hot spot of Canada was in Squamish, hitting nearly 30 degrees. As David Akin reports, much of the province has seen little rain since July and is facing serious drought conditions, already disrupting the region's fishery and agricultural activities.
Up and down British Columbia's coast, water levels are running dangerously low.
It is an absolutely dire situation.
Ruth Foster has worked with a coastal salmon hatchery since the 1970s, and she says these creeks should be filled with water and with salmon swimming up them to spawn. Instead, creek beds are dry and filled with boulders.
What we're concerned about right now are coho, returning to all these small coastal streams that are lacking water right now.
For coho salmon, the clock is ticking. Without access to these streams, they may die without spawning. These mostly pink salmon tried to ascend a creek near Bella Bella. Thousands perished when the creek dried up.
We're seeing it kind of across the territory and I think throughout the BC coast. So it's kind of unprecedented conditions right now.
The drought could have an impact on BC fisheries for years to come.
We've been on a steady decline for a long time, and situations like this don't help the overall health of the stocks of the salmon, that's for sure.
But it's not just the fishery. Agricultural activities throughout the province are suffering from the lack of rain, but it's most serious on Vancouver Island and BC's lower mainland, where provincial officials have put the drought at level 4 or, more serious, level 5, which means adverse impacts are almost certain.
In order for the drought to end, we're actually going to need some pretty strong, impactful storms, and dare I say, atmospheric rivers will be needed to actually end the drought.
Communities throughout the province are implementing conservation measures, including bans on all outdoor water use. It is most serious in a handful of towns on BC's Sunshine Coast, where the lake that is the source of municipal water is all but drying up.
We're losing our capacity to provide residents with water, that we're not able to provide enough water to our hospital as well as for firefighting.
And the forecast for southwestern BC? Maybe a chance of showers on Monday, followed by more heat and more sun. David Akin, Global News.
From droughts that threaten water supplies to devastating floods, hundreds of millions of people are now facing these new and ongoing climate threats. As Reggie Cicchini explains, a new study is warning that catastrophic scorching heat events that used to play out once every few hundred years are becoming much more frequent.
Cracked landscapes under a blistering sun became a trademark image during the summer of 2022. And across much of the northern hemisphere, from the U.S. desert to the parched shores of China's Yangtze River, extreme droughts endangered economies and lives.
We are already seeing the fingerprints of climate change in the drought that we've seen, and climate change is already hitting us hard.
Science has proven the world is warming, and the new study from the World Weather Attribution Group finds it's resulting in drier land. Scientists determined this by looking at water levels in soil, suggesting human emissions, which are raising the global temperature, have resulted in some of the most severe soil moisture droughts on record.
The events of the agriculture and ecological drought in the root zone was made at least 20 times more likely due to human-induced climate change.
At its most basic finding, droughts that were once in a 400-year event might now repeat every 20 years.
We do have time to influence the trajectory of our climate system. And yet we know that based on where we are on that trajectory, we really only have about 8 years before we start to see some of those negative consequences.
Climate change is already ravaging the world. It's not hypothetical. It's not a hypothetical threat.
2022's droughts would be an issue on their own, but factored in with the global food and energy crisis caused by the war in Ukraine, the situation was only exacerbated.
I like to think of climate change as a threat multiplier. So whatever kinds of threats we're facing as a planet, as a nation, as a family, climate change is going to ramp those up.
The study's authors do acknowledge that climate change can't be blamed for everything. Sometimes solutions themselves pose problems. Take flood mitigation that sends water out to sea rather than tanks to offset drought.
There are going to be constraints and limits to adaptation that we'll face dealing with these complexities going forward.
Complexities that scientists fear could result in perpetual or even permanent droughts if action isn't taken. Reggie Cicchini, Global News, Washington.
New details are emerging in a sexual assault scandal involving police officers in Newfoundland and Labrador. A lawsuit filed on behalf of 7 women in St. John's outlines a range of violations between the years 2001 to 2017 and the impact the assaults had on the alleged victims. Ross Lord reports.
The allegations are shocking that for years, uniformed officers with the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary were offering to drive women home from downtown St. John's and instead sexually assaulted them.
This was a horrible violation of trust. These women got in the cars with the police officers because they were police officers, and the officers abused that trust. It's really, really disturbing.
Some of the allegations were exposed in court when a judge sentenced Constable Doug Snellgrove to 4 years in prison for sexually assaulting a woman at her home while on duty. But a lawsuit filed in the Supreme Court of Newfoundland and Labrador suggests Snellgrove was not an isolated example. It claims 7 women were sexually assaulted, from unwanted kissing to forced intercourse, by on-duty RNC members. The lawsuit claims the women have chronically suffered acute and irreparable psychological harm and other severe impairments and disabilities, including substance abuse, loss of enjoyment of life, and humiliation and betrayal due to having been sexually battered. The lawsuit says the women are owed aggravated and punitive damages in addition to other damages.
I think that there is a culture of misogyny within the RNC, and I do not believe that steps are being taken to address that culture.
In an email statement, the constabulary said the RNC holds its officers and civilian staff to the highest standard of integrity, respect, and professionalism. The RNC quietly changed a policy last year so that officers can only offer drives to members of the public as part of a service call that's officially documented. The extent of the abuse is unclear.
The clergy sexual abuse scandal started in Newfoundland and Labrador as well, with Mount Castle in the 80s. And I hope that this is not a Canada-wide problem, but it certainly is a problem that we've been seeing a lot of here in Newfoundland and Labrador.
She expects more women to come forward in a scandal that's still evolving. Ross Lord, Global News.
Coming up, Jason Kenney deeply concerned about the future of conservatism in Canada. A Global News broadcast exclusive. Plus, how one Calgary woman is giving back to those in need this Thanksgiving weekend. Danielle Smith has been Alberta's Premier Designate for just a few days, and she's now campaigning for a seat in the legislature after announcing her intentions today. But before her party win this week, she was already ramping up rhetoric, appealing to controversial ideas involving Alberta's sovereignty, while endorsing baseless conspiracy theories, a direction that even outgoing Premier Jason Kenney admits he's not quite comfortable with in a new interview with the West Block. Mercedes Stevenson joins us now from Calgary with more on it. Mercedes.
Farah, Jason Kenney is a political lifer. He's spent 25 years as an elected politician and has never been defeated in a general election. But in an ironic reversal of fortunes, he was attacked by his own caucus and party, politically hobbling him, resulting in a leadership review and ultimately his decision to step down from politics. In a broadcast exclusive interview, Jason Kenney raised the alarm about the future of conservatism, what he calls populism with a snarl, a not so veiled reference reference to incoming Premier Danielle Smith. Kenney says the lack of civility dominating politics and politicians willingly catering to conspiracy theories is dangerous for conservatism and the country. He believes that COVID conspiracies have had a devastating impact on his ability to govern and manage his caucus. He fears that those conspiracy theories are now feeding a deep alienation, cutting some Albertans off from appeals based in fact or reason, and he's not sure how to come back from that.
I found through COVID an inability to communicate basic facts to a certain element of the population, and I don't know how to remedy that.
While Danielle Smith appealed to the more radical elements of what Kenney called QAnon-like conspiracy theories in her campaign, the question is if she will now moderate to appeal to a broader cross-section of Albertans. Whatever is next for Premier-designate Danielle Smith, it is clear that her main target will be Ottawa and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
The provinces are now beginning to realize that we are not a subordinate level of government to Ottawa, and Ottawa should be treating us with the same respect that they treat Quebec. That's all we're asking for.
There's no question that there is anger in Alberta for Smith to tap into, in a province where many have felt ignored and disrespected. But several of Smith's promises exceed the power of a premier. They're federal territory. The question now is whether the appeal of a champion against Ottawa will be enough to see the UCP re-elected in May. Or does Smith run the risk of using the same rhetorical gambit that got Jason Kenney in trouble, making promises without deliverables and facing an outraged electorate? Farah?
Mercedes Stevenson in Calgary. Thank you, Mercedes. And you can watch the whole interview with Jason Kenney on the West Block tomorrow morning, right here on Global. Ahead, breaking barriers. Meet the Canadian Medical Association's first Indigenous president. His plans to change this country's unequal healthcare system. The first Indigenous leader of the Canadian Medical Association is new in the job, but is the president of the largest group representing doctors in this country. Dr. Alika Lafontaine has his work cut out for him. The anesthesiologist from Grand Prairie, Alberta, has spent many years of his 20-year career helping marginalized Canadians navigate the healthcare system and advocating for their care. Tonight on The New Reality, Neetu Garcha speaks with Dr. Lafontaine, and she joins us now with more. Neetu.
When Dr. Alika Lafontaine first stepped into this new role, he wanted to ensure that people in leadership positions could see the barriers to health care that so many Canadians face. And because he's dealt with it firsthand too, he knows it's a deeply ingrained issue in Canadian medicine.
The experience of racism is real. I've experienced it myself. I have family members who've experienced it. And once we can acknowledge that things are real, we can then work towards those solutions that I think are in the hands of the people that experience them.
Adequate access to health care is something many Indigenous peoples face across the country. Some even fear seeing a doctor.
We have this history in Canada where we've been taught to look at Indigenous people certain ways. And we've internalized that within the healthcare system. Organizations like the Canadian Medical Association that have been around for 155 years, they're on their own path towards reconciliation. We've never had more Indigenous physicians in this country than we've had now. And we have a lot of people who, are acting as allies, trying to create spaces for these conversations.
Tens of thousands of doctors are members of the Canadian Medical Association, the largest advocacy group in Canada. Creating space to talk about inequities in healthcare is a step forward.
I know what it's like to have your voice silenced and pushed out. And I think because of that, I really have a strong drive to make sure that people don't experience those same feelings, because I know how painful that can be. And I really believe that if people understand that part of the experience, I think there's a real chance for human connection there.
Dr. Lafontaine also had a lot to say about how to fix a collapsing healthcare system, and he didn't hold back. He knows it's going to be a challenging year in the top job, but when speaking with him and hearing his stories about how he overcame barriers to finding success, it's clear he's up for the task ahead. Farah?
Neetu Garcha in New Westminster, BC. Thank you, Neetu. And you can catch Neetu's full story on Dr. Alika Lafontaine on The New Reality tonight at 7, right here on Global. Next, building boxes for those without. One woman's Thanksgiving tradition.
The political stories that matter to Canadians. The West Block with Mercedes Stevenson. Sundays on Global.
Many families across Canada will find it difficult to put food on the table this Thanksgiving. But one woman in Calgary is making a difference, one hamper at a time. As Norma Reed reports, a setback in her own life inspired her to help others.
Take this stuff out. It's a living room turned turkey warehouse.
I have a big freezer downstairs, and right now it's full.
Maria Pogarastu, founder of Maria's Food and Pantry Foundation, is making a big difference for dozens of deserving families this Thanksgiving.
I've been there to where some of the families they are now. And that's why I decided to do it.
6 years ago, she felt helpless after an unsuccessful surgery left her unable to walk.
I was forced to stay home, and I was looking for something to do.
Today, with help from her son, Denis Marcel, and friend Charlotte Landry, Maria's dream is a reality.
She got it off the ground and running all by herself when she really couldn't do any of the running. Well, now she's got people to do the running, so we do more. Like she says, she hollers, we run.
It's very important to be able to help out others who are in the similar same shoes as my mom.
Families can apply on her Facebook page. They will pick up a free hamper from her home filled with everything for Thanksgiving dinner. Those wishing to donate still have time and can reach out online.
I am very grateful that I'm able to do this right now, and I will keep doing it for as long as I can.
Proving it doesn't take a lot to make a big impact.
It's right from the bottom of our heart.
Norma Reed, Global News.
It's a big heart she has. And that's Global National for this Saturday night. I'm Farah Nasser, and on behalf of our whole crew, I want to thank you so much for spending part of your evening with us. Tonight's Your Canada is in Banff, Alberta. We love seeing Your Canada, so please keep emailing us your photos to viewers@globalnational.com. Until tomorrow, take care of yourselves and each other. Good night.